Welcome to my channel, The Magic of Java. This is an extract from my first book, The Green Queen from Java. It's a novel, it's a tale, a yarn intended to entertain you. Yes, it does reflect my experience of falling in love with Indonesia, my experience of falling in love with an Indonesian lady, and my increasing awareness of the paranormal and black magic, or some might like to say my descent into madness. But it is just a novel. Any resemblance to real people is completely unintentional. Yes, it's based on my experience, so yes, it's based on people I've met and know, but amalgams or caricatures of them. I do mention real people and real-life celebrities and hope that they, along with anybody who believes they've identified themselves, will forgive me. After being left by Frank Tooling, I decided to speak to the other Frank, at first in his toilet cubicle, but later I coaxed him out into the bar area of Chez Frank. I still couldn't see him. I rarely do see ghosts, but felt his presence very strongly. I asked him if he really was called Frank. He was not at all jovial like Frank Tooling. After all, he'd been in a toilet for over 50 years, with only his suicide to contemplate. He told me his name was Robert from Texarkana, but the rest of Frank's story was correct. When I told him that Frank wanted me to remove him, he became even sadder. I got the impression he felt betrayed by Frank, who he considered to be his only friend in the spirit world. At first I asked Bob to move forward to the light, psychopomp, which I believe he started to, and then became too frightened to do so. Clearly my mission from Frank was not as simple as Western spiritualists so often report. I asked him when he had been his happiness, and he said it was in Jakarta. He'd been one of the most extroverted customers in Chez Frank. He had many girlfriends, but settled with the one who was the girl of his dreams. I reminded Bob that he'd eventually killed himself, and he started to cry. I call him Bob, despite his preference for Robert. Somehow it takes away the ridiculous pomposity of a ghost who lives in a toilet. He explained to me that he was seeking revenge on those that had cheated him and led to his suicide. I suggested that maybe Indonesia wasn't really his happiest time. What about his childhood in Texarkana? My knowledge of some aspects of the world of the dead being more developed than Bob's may seem strange to the reader, but such thoughts are not unique and echoed in Jung's Red Book. Bob's mood changed when he was again upset that Frank should hatch a plan to get rid of him. But what really seemed to make the difference was when I told him that if he returned to Texarkana as a child, he would have the mind of Bob the child. Prior to his downfall, Bob had been very successful. He was clinging on to his material success and unwilling to let it go. Eventually, I persuaded Bob to leave the bar and join us in our house. But when we got into the house, Ma and Su Cheung turned on him. Bob had no experience of such things in the spirit world, and I'm not sure how long he stayed, but by the next morning he was gone. I say Bob had left him, but that's not entirely true. When a ghost visits a place or possesses a person, they never fully leave. Maybe all they leave is a memory, but that is enough for them to return without too much effort. That is exactly what happened to Titi on her second possession, and why she should not walk past the gold exchange again, or at least not until she is older and develops her mother's powers. I asked Ma why she'd been so inhospitable, and she told me that it was her house and up to her what she did and who she would allow in. She went on to say that I was stupid and meddling in things I didn't understand, and warned me to stop interfering with Bob, Was there not enough going on without introducing something else? I knew she was right, but I had made Frank a promise, and never break a promise intentionally. After all, without Frank, I felt I would have nothing. I could hear the words "stupid bully" ringing in my ears. Maddie's next dream disturbed her the most. She saw her mother in the market in Odessa, in Gunung Kidul, but she was not the older lady as she'd always appeared, but as a young girl in a mid-term of pregnancy. When Maddie approached her, she didn't recognise Maddie, just as she hadn't recognised Maddie or Buddy when they had visited her grave. Her mother ran into the toilet to get away from Maddie and locked herself in, saying she was displeased with Maddie and would not show herself until Maddie made amends. Maddie was distraught. She'd always been close to her mother. After all, they'd shared a bed until Maddie was 12. When Maddie's mother became ill, Maddie had persuaded Bertrand to pay for her treatment. But in rural areas, such actions rarely make any difference, partly because the doctors are so inadequate, but also as Muslims believe that when Allah calls on a person, it is wrong to cheat him, despite Muslims believing in free will. But what did all this mean? I thought, and then again, without hesitation, it came to me. Maddie's mother was tired. By becoming a young girl, she could escape the problems her family was facing. She just needed a little more space. Later, I realised that the toilet indicated where Paerte had placed a personal item of Maddie's to have power over her, or possibly where Ibuerte's family had hidden their gold when their home was attacked. But even this could be a metaphor. I began to realise that what little power Maddie's brother had all came from his mother, not his father as I had assumed, and that was why I felt nothing when visiting the father's grave. As a young man, the brother would order his then living mother to do his beckoning, even practising magic tricks on her. Worse still, during his incomplete training, he tried to kill his mother and brothers, which meant that many other brother-in-laws still keep their distance from him, probably adding to his sense of victimisation. In his work as a Dukan, he was commanding his dead brother, who was now tired. She knows that Maddie and I were slowly getting on top of family issues, and that she could now rest. She was handing over control to us, although we could not directly challenge the eldest brother, the head of the family. The best way for Maddie's mother not to answer her son's calls was to go back to a time before the Dukan brother was born. Of course, he was in her belly, so she could still care for him, but not give in to his demands. The unintended consequence of this was that she would not recognise any of her other offspring, all younger than Maddie's Dukan brother. I resolved to have it out with the brother when next in Gunung Kidul. Having found that Hero in Jogja sold beer, I bought an entire case. When I got home, I drank 3 large bottles of Bintang. Maybe it was Dutch courage, but it was very hot after having spent all afternoon in Jogja, buying oils in Mirota and Jimat at the market. I went to see the Dukan brother and his wife, and it all came out hastily in broken Bahasa, like waves pounding on a beach. Maybe even those same waves which Nira Kidul rode. Diplomatically and in deference to Javanese ways, I ended that the brother was the head of the family and now on his own. He needed to grow up and be a man, even though he was a few years older than me. Despite my poor Bahasa, they seemed to understand. This was a major achievement, as I had temporarily taken control of things and shown them some of my powers. There seemed to be an understanding that I would never challenge his work as a Dukan, and that he would leave his mother alone in mine and Maddie's care. The next day I realised that the young pregnant mother had taken up residence in our new home, which she loves. In fact, it was the location of her last house had been. I also found Bob in our house, who seemed to love it. Anything was better than another 50 years in a toilet. After all, Maddie's mother was less happy with Bob, who she found loud and crude. Some months earlier, Maddie's fifth brother's wife had a stroke, leaving her temporarily paralysed. The family couldn't afford the cost of treatment in Jakarta, so she moved in with her mother in Gunung Kidul. The doctors in Java wanted to operate, as surgery is the default in Indonesia. But Maddie persuaded the family that the sister would recover with time, and that an operation would probably make her worse. It was undoubtedly the prospect of saving the cost of the operation, but Maddie's advice was taken. After all, Maddie had experience with Prama. The family did, however, consult a dukun in Wonogiri, who was said to remove many objects from the sister's body, including needles, nails, eggs and scorpions. We visited the partially paralysed sister in a desa called Chandi, as there was indeed a largely unknown Chandi temple at its entrance. Chandi is a lovely desa surrounded by rice paddies. All the houses are old and of wooden construction, mostly teak, and sit perfectly in established gardens, so unlike our desa. Indeed, it reminded me a little of those half-tempered homes in established villages found in Cambridgeshire, Norfolk and Suffolk. What we hadn't known was that it was carnival, which we got horribly caught up in. Each marching band or themed costumes walked by. They would call into the car, "Hello, mister." The day the Bulle visited Chandi Carnival is probably now a part of the desa's folklore. Maybe they will all whiten their faces for years to come. As I remember when I was a child, I remembered people with blackened faces during the carnival. I also asking my father what they were, as in those innocent, and yes, more racist days, I had never seen a real black person. We eventually arrived at an old traditional Javanese house, but in a much better state of repair than I was used to. In fact, I remarked on how lovely it was. Like all Indonesian homes, with the exception of those Maddie has had a hand in, it was sparsely furnished. But what furniture there was antique teak, which would be highly prized in the West. I think the mother was beginning to lose her mental capacity and could not understand why this Chinaman kept calling her mother in Bahasa and did not respond to her questions in Javanese. You see, she had no experience of people with lighter skins other than Chinese, nor of people who couldn't speak Javanese. Pahaji is related to Maddie on her mother's side. He has recently been on Umrah, so we incorrectly called him Pahaji, rather than the more precise but never used Pa Umrah. He had returned with a serious disease of the leg, which everyone believed was as a result of going to Saudi Arabia to ask for wealth rather than forgiveness. Pahaji had been an Abdi Dalam at the Kraton in Jogja and now wanted to become one in Solo. He showed me photos of him in a military-style uniform at the Kraton. He certainly looked the part, with a bushy moustache and his tall stature. In fact, he was quite unlike the other residents of Gunung Kidul, being large like a bulle and having no difficulty in growing facial hair. Indeed, after Umrah, he didn't shave and managed to grow a full beard. In order to become an Abdi Dalam in Solo, he needed to show some good deeds in the community, and so he had set himself up as an unofficial doctor, like the Pa Ustad in Banten, but more genuine, if no more effective. In working as an Abdi Dalam, he would receive no payment, but it would confer even more status on him in the Desa and possibly some small economic benefits. When we visited, he was mid-consultation and he insisted I sit by his side. Madde wandered around the room and I knew that she knew what I had concluded and that he had no power at all and was simply guessing his way through his new vocation. Unlike Pahaji in Banten, he consulted a glass of water rather than the palm of his hand. He placed some tasbih beads in my hand that he had bought in Saudi, claiming them to be very powerful. They were made from kukua, the same wood that the Prophet Muhammad's tasbih. I felt nothing, although I was aware of some real power in the room that he was completely oblivious to. Slowly, my left hand grew warmer and warmer. I gave Madde both of my hands, and she was amazed at the temperature difference. There is a tradition within magic of calling black magic the left-hand path and white magic the right-hand path. The right hand is seen as giving, whereas the left hand is associated with receiving. So when I relieve Madde's symptoms with my left hand, I'm actually taking some from her. Maybe this is because the left-hand path assumes that we have control over our environment, as in our experience, that is a part of our psychology, whilst the right-hand path sees us as shaped by our environment. That is our destiny beyond our controls. Then traditionally, the right hand is seen as the hand of God. Of course, the two paths are a part of the whole, and as Kajawans recognise, that seeing them as mutually exclusive polarities is unrealistic. Indeed, the idea of left-hand path being evil is from the dualistic tradition of Romano-Christians, and in particular their superstitions, whilst most traditions see the left and right are mutually dependent. One might liken, even ascribe it to hemispheres of the brain. They are independent, yet mutually dependent, a position similar to that experienced by Friedrich Nietzsche in The Gay Science. One holds onto what is called good preserves the species, while what is called evil harms the species. In truth, however, the evil instincts are expedient, self-preserving and indispensable to as high degree as the good ones. Their functions are merely different. Furthermore, many of my abilities I have described as powers are seen as evidence of possession. Is it possible that I am unwittingly using black magic? Well, yes, it is possible, although we had believed the sensations on our left sides to be a sign that black magic's origins to our left, i.e. Pa and Ibu Erte's home. Whilst I refused to see Uncle Norman as evil and merely used in self-defence, if I am correct about his role in the Freemasons and their links to Solomonic black magic, then he was using black magic in self-defence. This is pure conjecture, as I am aware of the Anglo-Saxon Rosicrucian tradition, including the Enochian system, which Uncle Norman may well have practised, not least as the Rosicrucian Order Corantono Fellowship, of which Gerald Gardner was a member, had begun in Liverpool, and is purported to be a right-hand path. As I have argued, I see the distinction between black and white magic as a false distinction, and that our original fight against black magic strayed us into employing black magic, albeit in defence. So what I believed to be my powers, premonitions and sensations in my left arm are all signs of the use of black magic, or at least spirit possession. Maybe it is necessary for such black magic to be present before you can really understand how to overcome your torment. In fact, in asking for protection from black magic and communing with the spirits, I believed that I had strayed into black magic, despite always balancing this with my prayers to Allah. I have seen this dichotomy described in terms of being a slave to one's desires versus rising above one's desires, self-interest versus self-sacrifice and serving others. Surely one can only truly understand one of these sides without some appreciation of the obverse. Indeed, within Wayang, a traditional Wayang is a three-sided Gunung, a mountain representing good, evil and its shadow side. That night, Maddie was very troubled by her dreams. We persuaded Pahaji's son to take us to Jogja so that Maddie could buy some more artificial flowers and I could buy some more oils and jimat. On the way back, we called at Maddie's second brother, who also lives near Chandy. He and his wife were lovely people with twin sons, one of them whom lived and worked at a convenience store close by our home in South Jakarta. Both Maddie's brother and his wife look much older than they actually are. Their home is made from bamboo and bamboo matting with an earth floor, and the poorest I had been in. He owns no agricultural land and survives on what he can grow in his garden. We brought with us bags full of food and household goods from Carrefour in Jogja, which were warmly appreciated. He and his wife are the complete opposite to the Dukan brother and his wife, and are devout Muslims. I hadn't been there long when the ghost of an old lady appeared. We began talking and she wanted to know why she hadn't seen Maddie's mother recently. I explained and she asked me to send her regards and ask her to visit when she felt strong enough. Like Maddie's mother, she wanted me to help her family, which I promised to do. So when we meet, I always place some money in the palm of this brother's hand. I asked my brother-in-law who she was and was told that it would be the wife's mother. I assumed that they knew that she was there and often saw her, but apparently they didn't. Or maybe as devout Muslims, it was not something they would admit to in public, and certainly not to a bulle. When I got home, I wasn't sure if Maddie's mother would still be there, and felt sure that Bob would be back in his toilet. I couldn't believe what I found. They were both together on the sofa, getting on really well. I think Bob secretly fancied this now young lady, and Maddie's mother liked the attention. This seemed to give Maddie's mother a new lease of life, and she would switch between being young and old. She told me that when you scratch the surface, Bob was a nice, kind man. The day that I found out that Branwell had been sectioned under the Mental Health Act and admitted to a mental institution in Darlington, I also heard that my friend Jeff had died. Jeff was 10 years younger than me, and I'd met him on the night of my 30th birthday, which is an alternative starting point to my story, as it led to my first visit to Indonesia with Dr. Ruth. Outwardly, Jeff was very successful, handsome, clever and sorted person. Inwardly, he was tormented. His mother had died when he was young, and he never accepted it, despite his father taking a new and very understanding wife. He ended up an alcoholic, and rather like George Best, he would keep getting repaired in hospital and told not to drink, but he always relented. Eventually he died while visiting Southern California, where he'd spent his latter life working. What had really done it for Jeff was that he was sought after by financial institutions to develop code for their online banks. The banks would hire a luxury villa and lock gifted programmers from over the world in there until they had developed a fully functioning bank. Buoyed up with my success with Bob, and despite the dire warnings, I decided Jeff needed my help. Jeff was so surprised to hear from me. I explained that he would only be happy when he found his mother, and that she wasn't in California, but he could find her in York. Like Bob, there was also a reluctance to do this. I don't know why this is, and must one day ask Maddie's mother, who seems to be able to switch her age at ease. I think to fool her eldest son. Anyway, I invited Jeff to join me in Gunung Kidul. As in life, on my suggestion, he visited Ubud and loved it. Maddie's mother and Bob were immediately accepting of Jeff, but also being too preoccupied with each other to care. I shared everything with Jeff, who was astounded at my knowledge and my new powers. In fact, we talked constantly, with me explaining everything I was doing, almost like a tour guide for foreign ghosts. I then realised that I had not checked on Bob and was worried that he had become jealous of Jeff. But no, he was with Maddie's mother, happy as could be. Later, I was struck with a crisis of consciousness. After all, there had been dire warnings not to get involved, and I was way out of my depth. What if Bob wasn't Bob and Jeff wasn't Jeff, but Su Cheung trying to trick me and find a way to Buddy and Maddie? I asked Bob and Jeff, and they disappeared. What had I done? Instead of helping my loved ones, was I making it worse? Much later, Maddie's mother appeared as the older lady and told me to trust my instincts. After all, they had usually been spot on. Bob and Jeff were still there, and that I should apologise, which I did. Somehow, Jeff never seemed to come back as before. Was Jeff teaching me something? That ghosts can spread themselves over many locations, even across continents? Later that day, I felt a warm wind across my feet. Most of Indonesia never gets any wind, or at least not something someone from the northwest of England would call wind, and certainly not in the mountains of Gunung Kidul during the hot season. Indonesia defines only two seasons, the hot and the rainy, which corresponds to the winter and summer in Europe. But this isn't particularly helpful, as the temperature rarely changes, and it also rains in the hot season. More confusingly, most of Indonesia is in the southern hemisphere, so the hot season is when it is their winter. No fan was on at the time. Maddie later told me that she'd experienced the same thing from another room. Buddy and Maddie felt relieved that day, and nothing returned for some time. Months later, I had the same experience of wind across my face and chest, lying on our bed in South Jakarta, although this time it seemed to be bringing malevolence rather than it leaving. Then, some 18 months later, Gunung Kidul did experience some moderate winds in the hot season, which brought with it high waves on the coast and cool weather, at the same time that the UK was experiencing a heat wave. Some of Jeff did return with me to Jakarta, but didn't seem to mind Su Cheung and Ma, although I suspect they were no longer in our home, with Su Cheung only coming when sent by Pa Erte. I don't know whether I lost interest in being a tour guide to Jeff, or he'd had enough of my boring facts, but he now stays in California. The appearance and disappearance of Jeff are parts of my story that I'm the least sure of, but as Maddie's mother told me, to go with my instincts, so I have repeated them. Well, I hope you enjoyed this chapter. By all means, feel free to comment on it, including criticism, as that's the only way I can improve. Now, I really do hate it when channels keep badgering you to subscribe for them, but I suppose it does tell you when I'm going to post new chapters. I'm aiming to do this every week to 10 days, so it might be a good idea to subscribe if you want to. But thank you again for listening.